Welcome, friend, to History Lullaby. Tonight, we step softly into the bizarre, ambitious, and sometimes eyebrow-free world of medieval beauty standards. A world where the aim wasn't to look healthy, but rather like someone who had just been politely exercised. It's a curious kind of ideal, a beauty that hinted at fragility, delicacy, and a touch of excess, but all wrapped up in velvet and lace. Before we begin, if these stories help you relax, go ahead and subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. It's always so interesting to see where my fellow history wanderers are listening from. Now, dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan for that soft, comforting background hum, and ease into tonight's journey with me. Imagine yourself in a world where looking pale wasn't a sign you needed more rest, but rather a mark of high social status. The fashion of the time said, "The more you appear to be wasting away, the more you must be thriving." Step gently into the medieval world of beauty, where looks were a careful balance between health and decadence, and perfection was as fleeting as it was coveted. In the medieval world, beauty standards were deeply intertwined with class, status, and the rigid social structures that defined the lives of both the noble and the common people. One of the most prominent features of medieval beauty was the obsession with pale skin. In a society where survival often depended on physical labor, having pale skin was not just a matter of aesthetic preference, it was a powerful symbol of wealth, privilege, and leisure. To be pale was to announce to the world that you were so wealthy and high-ranking that you never had to venture outside to toil under the sun. This was a key marker of aristocracy. The paler your skin, the more you were perceived to have the time and means to avoid physical work. It was a form of beauty that spoke to the class divide in medieval society, a visual cue to separate the nobility from the peasants who worked the land. The idea of pale skin as an ideal beauty trait was not merely a superficial preference. It had social, economic, and even moral undertones. The common people, often farmers, laborers, and artisans, had tanned, weathered skin from working long hours in the fields or factories. Tanned skin, in fact, was often associated with manual labor, lower status, and a life spent in the sun, things that were not considered desirable in the eyes of the aristocracy. The noblewoman's pale complexion, by contrast, suggested that she lived a life of comfort and luxury, one removed from the hardships of labor. It was a physical manifestation of her status as someone who was not bound by the grueling realities of the working class. Pale skin was synonymous with the delicate and refined life that the nobility aspired to, a life that involved leisure, social gatherings, and beauty rituals, not the grind of laborious work. However, achieving that ideal of pallor wasn't as simple as staying indoors and avoiding the sun. For centuries, people went to extraordinary lengths to achieve the perfect complexion, resorting to dangerous and toxic substances in their pursuit of beauty. In the medieval period, the use of toxic cosmetics was widespread among the aristocracy. The most famous and most deadly substance used to whiten the skin was lead. Lead-based cosmetics, such as white lead powder, were commonly applied to the face and skin to achieve the coveted pale look. This toxic mixture, known as Venetian ceruse, was a key component of the beauty regimen for noble women during the Renaissance and medieval time. White lead powder was highly effective at whitening the skin, and it created the desired smooth, matte finish that aristocratic women sought. Unfortunately, the cost of this beauty was not only monetary, it was also physical. Lead, as we know today, is a potent neurotoxin, and prolonged exposure to it can cause a wide range of health problems, including skin damage, digestive issues, memory loss, and even death. Despite these well-known dangers, the use of lead in cosmetics continued well into the 17th century. The desire for that perfect white complexion outweighed the growing knowledge of the health risks involved. The beauty ideal of the time demanded a kind of perfection that came at a great cost. Women who used lead-based face powder would often experience side effects like hair loss, skin ulcers, and a range of other debilitating conditions. These toxic beauty practices were not just limited to the face, they extended to the entire body. The obsession with pale skin led some women to use vinegar-soaked cloths or harsh bleaching agents to lighten their skin further. Some even turned to crushed pearls, egg whites, and other mixtures in an attempt to lighten their complexion. adding another layer of toxicity to their beauty routine. The search for pale skin became a dangerous and all-consuming pursuit, one that could result in irreversible damage to the body. Mercury was another substance that played a role in this pursuit of perfection. Just like lead, mercury was used in some cosmetics, particularly for its ability to whiten the skin. Mercury, however, is even more toxic than lead, and its use in beauty products could result in severe poisoning over time. Mercury-based face powders and ointments were applied to lighten the skin, and, like lead, they left behind a glowing, smooth finish. However, mercury poisoning could lead to symptoms such as tremors, emotional instability, and even death. Despite these risks, mercury was still used in cosmetics for many years, with the aristocracy willing to take the dangers of slow poisoning in exchange for the ideal of delicate pale skin. The medieval fascination with pale skin was not limited to women alone. While women were the primary focus of beauty standards, some men also adhered to these beauty practices, particularly in later medieval and early Renaissance courts. Male courtiers, especially those in the upper echelons of society, were not immune to the pressure to conform to these ideals of beauty. Men too were expected to maintain a smooth, pale complexion, though they were less likely to use the lead-based products that women did. Instead, men sometimes applied powders or even relied on lighter, less toxic substances to achieve the pale look. Just as with women, pale skin in men signified wealth, privilege, and high-status qualities that were highly coveted in a time when appearance was everything. The pursuit of a pale complexion for men could be seen as a way of aligning oneself with the ideals of nobility, a way of saying, "I too belong to this elevated class, free from the toils of manual labor." Despite the rising awareness of the dangers of using these toxic substances, the quest for pale skin continued. This preference for pale skin reflected a broader cultural obsession with purity, innocence, and refinement. In medieval times, light skin was often associated with purity and grace. Pale-skinned women were seen as delicate, fragile, and virtuous, qualities that were highly valued in a society that placed a premium on modesty and femininity. The paler the skin, the more desirable a woman was in the eyes of society. She was a symbol of virtue, untouched by the harsh realities of physical labor. In contrast, dark skin, which was often associated with physical labor and the working class, was seen as less refined and even morally suspect. The ideal of pale skin thus became a symbol not just of wealth but of purity and nobility. In many ways, this obsession with pale skin can be seen as a reflection of the societal structure of the medieval period. The medieval world was rigidly stratified, with the aristocracy at the top and the peasants at the bottom. Skin color, or rather the appearance of skin color, became an outward sign of this social hierarchy. To be pale was to be privileged, while to be tan or dark was to be associated with hard labor and lower status. The pursuit of pale skin, with all of its associated risks, reinforced these social divisions and helped to maintain the status quo. The use of toxic substances like lead, mercury, and vinegar to whiten the skin can be seen as a symbolic act of distancing oneself from the laboring masses and aligning with the purity and refinement of the elite class. The cultural preference for pale skin had far-reaching consequences for both health and beauty standards. Women, and even some men, were willing to risk their lives for the sake of maintaining a pale complexion. They applied dangerous substances to their faces, necks, and arms in order to achieve the coveted look of fragile aristocracy, even as they knew, or at least suspected, the risks involved. This beauty ideal, while causing harm to countless individuals, was not an isolated phenomenon. It was a reflection of the larger values and ideals of the time. Pale skin symbolized wealth, status, purity, and grace, and the pursuit of it was deeply ingrained in medieval beauty culture. In the end, the desire for pale skin in medieval society serves as a powerful reminder of the lengths to which people will go to conform to beauty standards, regardless of the personal cost. It reflects the ways in which beauty ideals are shaped by cultural, social, and economic forces, and how these ideals are often bound up with larger societal structures of power and privilege. The obsession with pale skin in the medieval period and the dangerous methods used to achieve it, is a testament to the enduring power of beauty standards and the lengths to which people are willing to go to embody those standards. Despite the health risks and the eventual awareness of the dangers of lead, mercury, and other toxic substances, the allure of pale skin persisted as a symbol of high status and purity. And, even today, we can still see the echoes of that medieval beauty ideal in the ways we view skin tone, health, and beauty. In the medieval world, beauty ideals were not merely about the surface. They were intricately tied to social status, cultural values, and a deeply embedded desire to signify nobility and virtue. One of the most striking and unusual beauty standards of the time was the obsession with high foreheads. The medieval aristocracy held the belief that a high, unblemished forehead was the epitome of beauty, a symbol of both intelligence and nobility. To have a high forehead was to project an image of refinement and grace, to suggest a mind capable of deep thought and spiritual contemplation. This belief in the ideal forehead was rooted in the idea that the nobility were not only physically elevated, but also intellectually and morally superior to the common folk. To achieve this elevated look, women, and sometimes men, went to extraordinary lengths, employing extreme measures to modify their natural appearance. The forehead, in medieval times, was seen as the architectural centerpiece of the face. A high forehead was considered a mark of sophistication, intelligence, and divine favor. It was believed that the more space one's forehead occupied, the greater the person's intellectual capabilities. This ideal was not just a matter of appearance, it carried with it the suggestion that the individual's mind, like their body, was elevated above the common fray. In this deeply hierarchical society, beauty standards were a means of communicating one's place within the rigid structure of medieval life. To possess a high forehead was to belong to the ruling class, removed from the labors of the peasants and closer to the heavens. This ideal of the high forehead was not a simple cosmetic preference. It was a carefully cultivated look that came with a significant amount of grooming and, often, pain. Women of the medieval court, particularly during the Renaissance period, were willing to subject themselves to extreme measures in order to achieve the perfect forehead. The most common practice for achieving this look was the removal of the eyebrows, and in some cases even the hairline itself was modified to push the forehead higher. The process of eyebrow removal, particularly, was done with the belief that the absence of eyebrows would emphasize the height of the forehead and create an elongated, smooth line from the eyes to the hairline. This trend was not just limited to occasional plucking. Entire eyebrows were removed, often with the help of painful methods that left no trace of the natural brows that adorned the face. The tools used for eyebrow removal were rudimentary by modern standards, but they were considered effective for the time. Women would employ tweezers, which were sometimes heated to make the plucking more effective, or they would use hot cloths, or even harsh depilatory creams made from substances like quicklime, vinegar, or even cat dung. These were not merely methods for aesthetic enhancement, but were also viewed as part of a larger ritual of beauty, an investment in one's appearance that demonstrated not just dedication to beauty, but also a willingness to endure discomfort for the sake of social status. In some cases, women would not stop at merely plucking their eyebrows. To achieve the ideal high forehead, they would also pluck or even shave their hairlines back, sometimes removing entire sections of their scalp hair. This was often done with the aid of harsh depilatories, or by repeatedly shaving small sections of the hairline, slowly pushing it back further and further until the desired effect was achieved. It was an intense process that required both time and precision, as the forehead was not just an area to be shaped, but to be idealized. The resulting appearance was a smooth, unbroken expanse of skin that extended from the forehead to the temples, creating a look that was both ethereal and aristocratic. This practice of forehead modification, however, went beyond personal vanity. It was a deliberate choice that communicated a message to the world about one's status. By removing the eyebrows and shaving back the hairline, medieval women created a visual marker of distinction, one that clearly set them apart from the common folk. The more they modified their appearance to fit this ideal, the further they distanced themselves from the laborers who worked in the fields. whose lower status was marked by their darker, rougher features, including a prominent brow. The high forehead, with its clean, pristine expanse, spoke not only to the intellect, but also to a kind of divine grace, a connection to the purest form of beauty and nobility. It was a physical manifestation of an elevated social class, one that required both careful grooming and a great deal of social capital to attain. In the realm of art and literature, the idealization of the high forehead was perpetuated and reinforced. Portraits from the period frequently depict women with towering foreheads, their faces serene and untroubled, their eyes wide and expressive, framed by the absence of eyebrows. These portraits, often commissioned by wealthy patrons or royalty, further solidified the link between high foreheads and nobility. Poets and writers of the time, too, celebrated this beauty ideal, describing women with foreheads that seemed to stretch towards the heavens, implying not just physical beauty, but a connection to divine wisdom and grace. Interestingly, this trend was not isolated to women alone. During certain periods, particularly in the Renaissance, men in courtly circles also embraced the ideal of the high forehead. While the practice of plucking eyebrows was primarily a female one, some men also participated in this beauty standard, especially those who sought to align themselves with the intellectual and artistic elite. For men, a high forehead symbolized the same ideals of intelligence and refinement, offering a visual shorthand for their elevated status in a society that valued physical appearance as much as it did intellectual prowess. Men who aspired to the nobility's heights were not only concerned with their clothing, posture, and demeanor, but also with the way they presented their faces. The high forehead became an essential feature of a man's beauty, symbolizing his intellectualism, refinement, and social grace. But as with all beauty standards, the quest for the perfect forehead came with its own set of dangers and contradictions. While the noble class eagerly pursued these ideals, the physical toll of such extreme grooming practices could be damaging. Prolonged plucking and shaving of the hairline could lead to permanent hair loss, thinning hair, or scarring, leaving women with lasting reminders of their pursuit of beauty. The use of harsh chemicals and depilatories, including substances like vinegar and quicklime, could also result in skin irritation, burns, and other forms of damage. These risks were often downplayed or ignored in the pursuit of an unattainable ideal. The obsession with the perfect forehead, much like the pursuit of pale skin, reflected a larger cultural obsession with perfection, one that came at the expense of physical health and well-being. While the high forehead was ultimately an unattainable ideal for many women, those who managed to achieve it were often viewed with a mix of admiration and envy. They were the epitome of elegance and sophistication, the very picture of aristocracy and refinement. But beneath this pursuit of beauty lay a deeper societal pressure, a pressure to conform to an ideal that was both physically painful and psychologically taxing. Women were not simply expected to meet the physical standards of beauty, they were expected to internalize these standards, to embody them in every aspect of their lives, from their grooming habits to their behavior to their very souls. The high forehead, much like pale skin, was a sign that a woman had the time, wealth, and resources to dedicate herself to achieving the ideal. In the end, the obsession with high foreheads and the removal of eyebrows is a striking example of how beauty standards were both a reflection of and a tool for enforcing social hierarchy. The pursuit of the perfect forehead, achieved through painful and extreme measures, was not simply about personal vanity, it was a way of marking one's place in the social order. For the women who adhered to this ideal, the high forehead was more than just a beauty trend. It was a statement of status, an indication that they were of noble birth, intellectually refined, and above the toils of the lower classes. It was a beauty standard that went beyond physical appearance, tapping into the complex interplay between beauty, power, and societal expectations that defined the medieval period. In many ways, it was the epitome of what beauty meant during this time. Not a reflection of natural beauty, but a crafted, sculpted ideal that separated the elite from the masses. The pursuit of beauty in the medieval and early Renaissance world often blurred the line between art and danger, delicacy and destruction. Among the most infamous practices that arose in pursuit of an idealized look were the use of toxic substances like lead and mercury in face powders, designed to achieve that signature pale complexion that signified wealth, nobility, and refined taste. It was an era where beauty wasn't just skin deep, it was laced with a fatal kind of ambition, where the pursuit of a flawless, ethereal appearance came at a very real cost. To look delicate, fragile, and untouched by the harshness of the world was to be a member of the elite, to embody an ideal of nobility that was far removed from the earthy struggles of the working class. But, as history often shows, even the most luxurious ideals often carry an undercurrent of pain. Beauty, in this case, was no exception. The medieval aristocracy and their Renaissance counterparts were obsessed with pale porcelain skin. To them, paleness was the marker of nobility, of wealth, and of leisure, a sign that one did not toil under the sun like the peasant class, whose sun-kissed, weathered skin was an unwelcome reminder of hard labor. The ideal pale complexion was not just about aesthetics, it was a social flex. To be pale was to be above the earthbound grind of everyday life. And so, in pursuit of this lofty ideal, noble women and men alike resorted to whatever means necessary, even if those means involved dangerous chemicals and toxic substances that would slowly chip away at their health. Face powders, often made from lead, were the go-to product for achieving that alabaster glow. Lead, known for its malleability and ability to create a smooth, flawless finish on the skin, was used in a variety of ways, though, most famously, in the form of a white powder that, when applied to the face, created a matte, pale sheen. It was, for all intents and purposes, the medieval version of foundation, used to create a porcelain-like complexion that seemed to shimmer with the lightest touch. These face powders were not only used by women, but also by men of the aristocracy, who, in their efforts to appear delicate and refined, also embraced the beauty trends of the time. Men, like their female counterparts, used these products to emphasize their nobility, an indication that they were too rich to work and too privileged to spend time in the Sunday. The pale face, with its even, unblemished tone, was a sign of being above the toil and trouble of everyday life. But while the idea of flawless skin may seem appealing, the ingredients used to create this ideal complexion were anything but harmless. Lead-based makeup was notoriously toxic, and though it was widely used, its side effects were all but unknown to the wearers who smeared it on their faces. Lead, when absorbed through the skin, would slowly poison the body. The long-term effects of lead poisoning were terrifying, ranging from severe abdominal pain to cognitive dysfunction, to hair loss, to death. Yet, for centuries, the allure of pale skin, the desire to be perceived as elegant and refined, overshadowed the very real risks of the makeup that was being applied. To look fragile and delicate, to embody a kind of ethereal beauty, was worth the risk for many. But lead wasn't the only toxic substance that was used in these cosmetics. Mercury, too, found its way into face powders and rouges, further compounding the danger. Mercury-based face powders were sometimes applied to give the face an even paler, more luminous glow. Like lead, mercury is a potent poison that has long been known for its harmful effects on the human body. Chronic exposure to mercury can lead to neurological damage, tremors, memory loss, and even death. Despite these well-known dangers, people continued to use these toxic substances, often in combination with other ingredients such as vinegar, egg whites, and crushed pearls, all in the name of beauty. The desire to appear delicate, to present oneself as untouched by the roughness of the world, was so strong that these poisons were overlooked, ignored in the pursuit of perfection. The application of these toxic substances was not done in a single simple step. The process of achieving the ideal pale complexion was long, intricate, and involved multiple products. After applying the lead-based powder to create a smooth, pale surface, women would often add rouge made from the most dangerous ingredients imaginable. This was a way of giving color to the cheeks, a delicate flush that, when used in moderation, would create an illusion of youthful vigor. The powdered rouge was often made with mercury, adding yet another layer of toxicity to an already dangerous beauty routine. For many, the rosy cheeks created by this rouge were the final touch. giving the face the illusion of life and health. But beneath the glow was the insidious damage caused by the very products meant to enhance one's beauty. As with most things in life, the desire for beauty was tempered by an equally powerful desire for perfection. A slight imperfection in the skin, an uneven tone, a blemish, these were all seen as flaws that could diminish one's social standing. A noble woman, particularly, was expected to embody grace, dignity, and flawless beauty. Any imperfection was an insult to her status and, by extension, to the reputation of her family. This pressure to conform to an unattainable standard of beauty led to an ever-increasing reliance on toxic products. These beauty products didn't just harm those who used them, though. They were a sign of the social and economic divide that marked medieval society. The elite were willing to risk their lives to achieve a look that marked them as separate from the working class, separate from the laborers who spent their days in the sun, who had hands calloused from hard work, and whose skin showed the marks of their physical labor. To wear pale skin was to indicate that one had the privilege of being free from such labor, free from the dirt and the heat and the wear and tear of the outside world. It was a silent message that said, "I don't work, I don't toil, I am above all of that." But the cost of that pale skin was steep. Not only were those who used these products slowly poisoning themselves, but they were also buying into a standard of beauty that was so narrowly defined that it excluded vast swathes of the population. The pursuit of beauty, in this case, was not just a personal endeavor. It was a way to signal one's social status, to display to the world that one was not just wealthy, but above it all, untouched by the hardships of daily life. But this ideal of beauty came at a heavy price, a price that, for many, was paid in skin ulcers, hair loss, and even premature death. Despite the very real dangers posed by these beauty products, the trend of using lead and mercury-based powders persisted for centuries. The desire to achieve the perfect pale complexion was so deeply ingrained in the cultural fabric of medieval and Renaissance society that it was almost impossible for people to stop using these toxic substances. It was not until the 18th century that the dangers of lead and mercury poisoning became more widely recognized. But even then, the allure of pale skin continued to captivate many. The long-term effects of these toxic beauty practices were severe. Women who used these powders for years suffered from chronic health problems, including hair loss, which was often the most visible sign of their self-inflicted damage. It was a tragic irony that in their attempts to appear youthful and delicate, women were instead accelerating their own physical decline. In many cases, the effects of mercury and lead poisoning went beyond physical ailments. Women who had used these products for prolonged periods often experienced mental deterioration, their minds clouded by the very substances they had applied in the pursuit of beauty. The damage done by these cosmetics was insidious, slow, invisible, but ultimately devastating. In the end, the use of toxic face powders in the pursuit of pale skin was more than just a matter of physical harm. It was a reflection of the deep societal pressures placed on women, particularly those of the noble class, to conform to a rigid standard of beauty. It was a symbol of their separation from the working class, a sign of their elevated status, but it was also a silent condemnation of the lengths to which they were willing to go to achieve that status. The price of beauty, in this case, was not just financial, it was also a matter of life and death. The desire for pale skin, the obsession with fragility, and the willingness to poison oneself for the sake of beauty speak volumes about the social pressures and ideals of the time. It was a society where beauty was not just a physical attribute, but a deeply symbolic one, tied to wealth, nobility, and virtue. But it also reveals the dangers of unchecked vanity, the lengths to which people will go to attain the unattainable, and the tragic consequences of adhering to a beauty standard that demands nothing less than perfection. In the end, beauty was not just about what was on the outside, it was about what was hidden beneath the surface, slowly poisoning those who sought to embody it. In the medieval and Renaissance periods, beauty was often a reflection of one's social standing, moral character, and adherence to strict codes of refinement. As trends came and went, the face was often the most telling feature of one's identity, not just a canvas of personal expression, but an indication of nobility, virtue, and even divine favor. Among the many ideals that governed the physical appearance of women, perhaps none was as strange or as perplexing as the obsession with high, smooth foreheads. It was a look that demanded the complete removal of eyebrows, a fashion trend that left the face eerily smooth, almost otherworldly, but also deeply unsettling. To achieve the ideal of the perfect, unblemished forehead, women would resort to some of the most extreme and painful methods of grooming ever devised. Imagine the scene. A noble woman, sitting before her mirror, perhaps in the soft glow of a candle, or in the half-lit chamber of a castle, carefully removes her eyebrows. What was once a feature of her face, bold, expressive, perhaps even wild in its natural form, was now being eradicated with painstaking precision. The forehead, which had been but a modest part of the face, now became the focal point. With the removal of the eyebrows, it was as though her identity was being reshaped, her femininity redefined. This new face, unencumbered by the distractions of eyebrows, would present an image of purity, of elegance, and above all, of nobility. For in this world, the removal of one's eyebrows, the very erasure of what made one human and grounded, symbolized a departure from the roughness of life, a gesture of separation from the peasantry, from the toil and labor of the common folk. It is hard to imagine how this trend began, and even harder to understand why such an extreme practice became so popular. Eyebrows, it seems, had become something undesirable, a mark of the earthly, the common. In an age where beauty was often equated with fragility and delicacy, anything that gave a face a sense of strength, character, or natural wildness was seen as improper. The nobility especially wanted to craft a face that appeared delicate, ethereal, and removed from the harsh realities of life. A smooth forehead without the interruption of eyebrows was the epitome of this ideal, an emblem of refinement, intelligence, and purity. The first step in achieving this coveted look was, quite simply, to remove the eyebrows. But this was no gentle, tweezer-like plucking that we might imagine today. No, the methods used in the past were far more intense and hazardous. The tools at their disposal were primitive, and the techniques cruel. Tweezers, then a newfangled invention in some parts of the world, were often employed. These crude instruments would pull the hair out by the root, causing extreme pain, and sometimes even leaving scars. But it didn't end there. In the pursuit of smoothness, women also turned to wax, a sticky, painful substance that was heated, applied to the skin, and then torn away along with the hair. The process was not for the faint of heart. The wax could tear at the skin, causing irritation and discomfort, leaving behind a raw, tender surface. If the pain from tweezers and wax wasn't enough, some women resorted to even more dangerous substances. Arsenic, known for its deadly properties, was occasionally used to help remove the hair. The toxic chemical would be applied to the skin, burning away the hair follicles, but also putting the woman's health at grave risk. Over time, arsenic can poison the body, leading to severe internal damage and even death. Yet, in the pursuit of beauty, these women were willing to endure whatever pain or danger was necessary. The idea that pain could be a pathway to beauty was deeply ingrained in the culture of the time, and many women saw these extreme methods as a rite of passage, proof of their commitment to the ideal of nobility. But the removal of the eyebrows wasn't just a matter of erasing a feature from the face. It was, in many ways, an act of transformation. The smooth, high forehead that was left in place of the eyebrows became the new canvas. It became the focus of the face, a symbol of purity and nobility. This trend of eyebrow removal, combined with the obsession for pale, unblemished skin, created a look that was almost supernatural in its perfection. The forehead was often described as angelic or divine, as though it was a representation of the heavenly realm, untouched by the imperfections of earthly life. And yet, beneath the surface of this idealized beauty lay the harsh reality of the practices that women were willing to endure. In the quest for beauty, the physical toll was only one part of the picture. The social implications of such beauty standards were profound. A woman with a smooth forehead and no eyebrows was no longer just a woman. She was a symbol of her class, her status, and her wealth. To be a noblewoman in this time was to constantly engage in a silent competition with other women of your station. Your beauty, your poise, your delicate features were markers of your place in the social hierarchy. The removal of eyebrows, then, was not just a cosmetic choice. It was a symbol of one's commitment to beauty, a message to the world that you were of the aristocracy, untouched by the laborious world of the peasantry. But this ideal of perfection was, of course, fleeting. Just as the trends of today come and go, so too did the trend of eyebrow removal. What was once seen as beautiful, angelic, refined, and noble was eventually replaced with new ideals. And yet, the impact of these practices lingered, even as beauty trends evolved. Women who lived through the era of eyebrow removal often bore the physical scars of their beauty rituals, scars that not only marked their skin, but also the social expectations placed upon them. The pursuit of beauty, it seemed, came with a heavy price. And as the centuries passed, the trend of eyebrow removal faded into history, replaced by new standards, new desires, and new ideals of beauty. But there is something timeless about the need to define oneself through physical appearance, to create a face that reflects one's inner identity and status. The ideal of the smooth forehead, the absence of eyebrows, was a beauty standard that transcended its time, as it laid the groundwork for future generations to grapple with the ever-changing nature of beauty, identity, and social expectation. And though we may look back at these extreme beauty rituals with a mixture of fascination and horror, they remain a testament to the lengths that people, particularly women, would go to in order to conform to the cultural norms of their time. In the end, the no-eyebrow trend was more than just a passing phase. It was a statement about beauty, nobility, and the complex, sometimes dangerous intersection of appearance and identity. It was a statement that marked a period in history where the face, the forehead, and the eyes became battlegrounds for social status, where beauty was not merely an outward expression but a weapon used to define one's place in the world. In the world of medieval and Renaissance beauty, one of the most enduring symbols of femininity, youth, and fertility was the subtle blush, the delicate flush of color that graced the cheeks. A faint, rosy tint was considered not just attractive but divine, marking a woman as healthy, pure, and, most importantly, desirable. The ideal blush suggested not only the soft glow of youth but also a sense of modesty, as though the color had risen naturally from within, triggered by a romantic thought, a sweet memory, or even a whispered poem. Yet beneath this ethereal ideal of beauty, behind the rosy cheeks that signified life and vitality, there was a darker side to the pursuit of perfection, a side where beauty was not so much natural as it was crafted, sometimes with the help of the most unexpected and often dangerous ingredients. To understand the obsession with blushing in the medieval period, one must first recognize that beauty was a delicate balance. It wasn't about looking healthy in the way we might imagine today, vibrant, full of energy, with a fresh and natural glow. No, beauty in these times had an almost mystical quality. A perfect woman wasn't one who simply thrived. She was one who embodied fragility, purity, and the frailty of life itself. She was like a delicate flower that bloomed briefly before the winds of time swept her away. And so, the pursuit of a flawless face was not merely about cosmetics, but about embodying the transient nature of beauty, about capturing a moment in time that seemed eternal. For women of nobility, a subtle blush wasn't just a feature, it was a language, one that signified not only youth but also fertility, the promise of life, and the ultimate ideal of femininity. It suggested that the woman was still untouched by the rigors of age and labor, that she existed in a realm above the harshness of the world. To blush, or to appear as if you were blushing, meant you were alive in a way that everyone could see and understand. It was a mark of vitality, something you couldn't fake, or so it seemed. But of course, in a world where beauty was a symbol of class and status, where appearance could elevate or diminish your standing in society, even the most natural of traits had to be enhanced. And so, the quest to achieve the perfect blush led to the introduction of cosmetics, both natural and toxic, that would help women achieve that delicate glow. At first glance, One might think that the ideal blush would be achieved by some simple natural method, a pinch of rose petals, a dab of honey, perhaps a little light exposure to the sunday, but that would be too simple for a world as steeped in symbolism and excess as medieval Europe. Instead, women reached for whatever materials they could find, whether they were truly natural or not, to achieve the desired rosy cheeks. Beetroot juice, for example, was one of the more innocuous ingredients used to simulate the flush of youthful vitality. The juice of the beetroot, when applied lightly to the skin, would stain it a reddish hue, giving the illusion of a healthy, glowing complexion. It was a relatively safe option compared to the more dangerous substances that were often used, and it didn't carry with it the toxic risks of many of the other ingredients. But in a world where beauty was about excess, women who could afford it didn't stop with simple vegetables. Instead, they reached for substances that were as harmful as they were effective. Perhaps the most famous of these toxic substances was red lead. This heavy metal, with its deep, vibrant hue, was often used in the creation of rouge, the early precursor to modern blush. Red lead was applied to the cheeks, often mixed with other ingredients to create a smooth, glowing finish. The color was intense, giving the cheeks the exact look that was desired, a flush that seemed to radiate from within. The result was striking, but the price was high. Red lead, as we now know, is highly toxic, and regular use could lead to a host of health problems. Over time, red lead would seep into the bloodstream, poisoning the body and causing damage to the nervous system. It could result in skin ulcers, hair loss, and, in the most severe cases, premature death. Yet, despite these risks, women continued to use it, driven by the desire to meet the ideal of beauty, even at the cost of their own health. But red lead wasn't the only dangerous substance that women used to achieve the perfect rosy cheeks. Mercury, with its glimmering liquid form, was another toxic ingredient commonly employed in cosmetics. Mercury was often used in preparations to lighten the skin and add a touch of color to the cheeks. It had a unique ability to create a smooth, flawless finish, and for a time, it was regarded as cutting edge. The results were often stunning pale skin with a radiant, rosy glow. But mercury, like red lead, was a silent killer. Its effects were insidious, slowly poisoning the body over time. Mercury poisoning could lead to a range of symptoms, from tremors and memory loss to organ failure and death. Yet, for many, the pursuit of beauty outweighed these concerns. The desire to achieve the ideal, pale, delicate look was too strong to resist, and so they continued to apply these deadly substances, oblivious to the long-term consequences. The use of such toxic ingredients wasn't limited to just the face. To further enhance the rosy glow, women would sometimes use rouge that contained a variety of other harmful substances. Lead was often mixed with other ingredients like chalk dust, which helped the makeup stay in place longer, or egg whites, which gave the skin a smooth, glazed appearance. These substances, too, were not without their risks. The combination of harsh chemicals could cause the skin to crack and peel, leading to painful ulcers and scarring. But for those committed to the ideals of beauty, these side effects were simply the price to be paid. Women, especially those of the nobility, were willing to endure whatever was necessary to achieve the perfect complexion, the flawless appearance that would set them apart from the common folk. A delicate blush on the cheeks became a mark of distinction, a way to show the world that they were not only beautiful but refined, cultured, and untouched by the laborious world outside their gilded chambers. Beauty was, after all, a symbol of class, and to be beautiful meant to be elevated above the mundane concerns of survival and manual labor. But the quest for the perfect blush was not just about looking healthy, it was also about looking otherworldly. The delicate flush was not merely a sign of vitality, but of fragility. It hinted at a woman who was so delicate that even the smallest spark of emotion, a whispered word, a fleeting thought, could cause her cheeks to bloom with color. It was an ideal that suggested a woman who was always in a state of gentle bloom, like a flower in spring, full of life but never fully grounded in reality. And so, the beauty rituals that accompanied this ideal were designed to enhance that sense of fragility, to create a look that was ethereal and unattainable. As the centuries passed, these beauty standards began to evolve. The use of toxic substances like red lead and mercury began to wane as the dangers of these materials became more widely known. But the obsession with pale skin and rosy cheeks remained, and new, safer alternatives began to emerge. Modern blush, in all its powdered glory, is far removed from the dangerous concoctions of the past, but the desire for that perfect flush, for the illusion of youth and fertility, remains as strong as ever. In a world where beauty was both a social marker and a symbol of morality, the pursuit of the perfect blush was a reflection of the deep-seated cultural values that governed medieval and Renaissance life. It was a pursuit that demanded sacrifice, whether in the form of pain, discomfort, or even death. But for those who could afford the cost, the reward was clear: beauty, status, and the power to command attention in a world where appearance was everything. Blonde hair, in the world of medieval and Renaissance beauty, was nothing short of a divine symbol. It wasn't simply hair, it was the golden halo of purity, youth, and beauty. Long before modern notions of hair care, long before the familiar bottles of shampoo and conditioner lined the shelves of our bathrooms, hair was an emblem, a sign of virtue, and, in many ways, a mark of social standing. The ideal woman, it was said, had hair that cascaded like sunlight, shining with the radiance of the very heavens. Blonde hair was not merely fashionable, it was sacred. It symbolized youth, purity, and a divine connection, as though the woman who wore it could do no wrong. It was the ideal that every noble woman strived for, and for many, it became a lifelong pursuit. In a society where so much of one's identity was defined by appearances, the pursuit of blonde hair was one of the clearest signals of wealth and status. The paleness of one's complexion was an obvious giveaway, but the color of one's hair was a subtler sign. Dark hair was often associated with peasants, manual laborers, or anyone who had to work under the harsh sun day. A tan or darker hair color suggested you were toiling away, sweating in fields or kitchens, earning your bread in the Sunday. But blonde hair, oh, that was a different story. If you had blonde hair, you were a creature of the indoors, a lady of the court, or a noblewoman whose only concern was cultivating her beauty, not laboring for her survival. Blonde hair was a symbol of youth, something that many women desired to keep long into their later years. In a world where age was a thief, stealing vitality and beauty with every passing year, blonde hair was a marker that could keep a woman tethered to the idea of youth, even if her body betrayed her. It was said that as long as a woman had blonde hair, she remained untarnished by the ravages of time. It was the perfect complement to the pale, delicate skin that had come to define feminine beauty, soft, pale skin that could only be maintained through a life of luxury, a life in which one was never exposed to the hard, bright rays of the Sunday. But blonde hair didn't always come naturally, and for many women, achieving the golden ideal meant embracing methods that were often as bizarre as they were dangerous. To be truly fashionable, to reach the pinnacle of beauty and desirability, a woman needed her hair to shine like spun gold. For those who weren't born with blonde locks, the task was a more difficult one, but it was a task that many were willing to undertake. Beauty, after all, was not merely a matter of nature. It was a matter of artifice, of carefully crafting an appearance that met the ideal. And to achieve that, many turned to hair-lightening methods that were as strange and as toxic as any other cosmetic practice of the time. One of the most common methods for lightening hair in the medieval period was the use of saffron, a spice so precious it was often worth its weight in gold. Saffron was considered to have a range of uses, from culinary to medicinal, but its role in beauty was particularly important. When mixed with other ingredients, saffron was believed to have a bleaching effect on the hair, lightening it to the desired shade of pale gold. The process wasn't exactly gentle, however. Saffron, when applied to the hair, could be harsh, drying it out and leaving it brittle. Yet for many women, the price of golden locks was worth the cost. Saffron wasn't cheap, but it was worth every penny to achieve the ideal of blonde beauty. Honey, too, played a role in the quest for blonde hair. Honey, with its natural lightening properties, was applied to the hair in much the same way as saffron. Women would slather their hair with honey, then sit outside in the sun, hoping the rays would work in tandem with the honey to lighten their tresses. The process, though more natural than saffron, was still incredibly time-consuming. The honey would be left on for hours, sometimes even days, and would need to be washed out thoroughly afterward. The result was a lighter shade of hair, often with a slight golden tint, but it came with a catch. As anyone who has worked with honey knows, it's sticky. And after a long day of sitting in the sun, covered in sticky honey, the result wasn't always the radiant golden locks one might hope for. But perhaps the most bizarre and most dangerous method of lightening hair was the use of urine. Yes, you read that right. Urine, often from young boys, was collected and applied to the hair in a desperate attempt to bleach it to a golden hue. The ammonia in urine was thought to have a bleaching effect, stripping away the dark pigments in the hair and leaving it lighter. This method was far from hygienic, and it carried with it a significant health risk. The use of urine, while seemingly odd, was not uncommon in an era where resources were scarce, and beauty was something to be pursued at any cost. It's hard to imagine today the lengths to which women in the past were willing to go to achieve their ideal appearance. Urine-based treatments were part of a larger tradition of using whatever natural resources were available, no matter how unpleasant they might seem now. But beyond these strange methods of lightening, there was the social symbolism of hair length itself. Long hair was considered the ultimate sign of femininity. For unmarried women, long, flowing locks were a symbol of innocence, beauty, and virginity. A woman with long hair was seen as a maiden, pure and untouched by the world. Her hair was her crown, her symbol of grace and youth, and it was something she could wear with pride. In an age where women were often judged based on their appearance, having long, beautiful hair was a way to assert one's status as a young, unspoiled woman. But as with all things in life, there was a price to pay for this ideal. To maintain long hair was no simple task. The care required was extensive. Long hair needed constant washing, grooming, and oiling to keep it soft and manageable. In an age before modern hair products, women relied on oils like olive oil or almond oil to keep their hair shiny and smooth. Brushes were often made from bone or wood, and the process of untangling long hair could be tedious and time-consuming. But long hair, in all its glory, was worth the effort. It was the visual representation of a woman's beauty, her youth, and her place in society. For women who had married, however, the rules changed. Once a woman was married, long hair was considered too suggestive of her youth, of her unmarried state. It was too distracting, too flirtatious, and it became a symbol of something that was no longer appropriate for a married woman. Long hair had to be hidden away. Married women were expected to cover their hair, to keep it modest and contained. This wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a cultural imperative. The moment a woman married, her hair was no longer her own to display. It was a symbol of her new role, of her responsibility to her husband and her family. The traditional head coverings for married women varied from region to region, but one of the most famous was the wimple, a piece of cloth that covered the hair and neck, often leaving only the face exposed. The wimple became a symbol of a woman's married state, a way to signal that she was no longer a girl to be admired from afar, but a woman of society who had taken on the responsibilities of marriage. But even this shift in hair fashion didn't completely silence the desire for beautiful, long hair. Some women still found ways to let a bit of their hair slip out from beneath their veils. A loose curl here, a strand that escaped the confines of the wimple there. These little rebellions against the rules of propriety were the only ways some women could cling to their youthful beauty. It was a subtle act of defiance, a way to preserve a connection to the ideal they had once embodied, before marriage had changed everything. Blonde hair, especially, carried with it the weight of symbolism, representing not only beauty but purity and youth. It was a visual marker of a woman's role in society, her status, and her desirability. And for those who didn't have the natural golden locks that were so highly prized, the methods of achieving blonde hair were as strange as they were dangerous. Whether it was the use of saffron, honey, or even urine, the lengths to which women were willing to go to achieve this ideal were extraordinary. Yet, despite the risks and hardships, the pursuit of blonde hair and all that it represented was something that many were willing to endure. Long blonde hair was not just a fashion, it was an embodiment of an ideal, a symbol of what it meant to be young, beautiful, and pure. And though the methods to achieve this ideal have evolved and changed throughout history, the desire to attain the perfect hair, to embody the beauty of youth and grace, remains a timeless pursuit, one that echoes through the ages like a golden thread, winding its way through the tapestry of history. The hennin, that towering cone-shaped hat, is one of those symbols of medieval nobility that endures in our collective imagination. We often see it in old portraits, immortalized in the elaborate dress of the courtly elite, towering above the delicate faces of noble women. It is a visual marker of social standing, a crown that, in the eyes of the medieval world, spoke louder than any fine jewel or embroidered gown ever could. The hennin was, in its essence, a statement, both a literal and figurative extension of the aristocratic ideal. To wear it was to declare, "I am of the nobility. I stand above, both in the literal sense and in the societal one." It wasn't just a practical head covering. No, the hennin was a symbol, carefully designed and carefully worn to express that the wearer belonged to a class that could afford to flaunt such impractical adornments. The high-arched, pointed structure of the hennin seemed to reach for the heavens, embodying a status that could not be achieved through work, labor, or the sweat of one's brow. It was a bold declaration that if you were wearing such an extravagant hat, you had no need to engage with the earth in the way the peasants did. The higher the hennin, the higher your social standing. The more extravagant the hat, the more respected you were in your noble community. Noble women from all corners of Europe donned these elaborate, often comically high, cone-shaped creations. From the courts of France to the halls of England, the hennin became synonymous with aristocracy, and by the late 14th century, it had reached its peak in terms of height and grandeur. Fashion, as it tends to do, escalated, and the hennin was no longer just a simple cap, it was a towering structure, sometimes reaching as high as 2 feet. These hats, constructed from fine silks, velvets, and other luxurious fabrics, would have been decorated with intricate patterns, metallic thread, and occasionally jewels to further assert their wearer's wealth. The form was often supported by a wire frame, ensuring that the hennin stood as tall and proud as possible, cutting an imposing silhouette against the social landscape. But what made the hennin truly stand out was its undeniable symbolism. The shape itself was a reflection of the medieval ideal of nobility, pointed, sharp, and structured, indicating that the wearer was refined, controlled, and, above all, above the common masses. It represented the very idea that the noble class had access to the finer things in life and the ability to indulge in excess for no reason other than to show their superiority. It was not a practical hat, nor was it designed for function. No, the hennin was entirely about form. It was a social flex, a statement of wealth and status. Women in the noble class took great pride in these towering headpieces. It was a way to separate themselves from the common folk, those who wore simpler, more practical attire that lacked the extravagant flourishes of courtly fashion. But the hennin wasn't just about what the hat said about the wearer's place in society. It was also about what it represented in terms of beauty and femininity. The height of the hennin, reaching toward the sky, was symbolic of a woman's elevated position in society, her beauty amplified not only by the delicate features of her face, but by the very structure of her headwear. It was as though the longer the peak, the more ethereal, the more unattainable she became. At the same time, the wearing of the hennin often required women to hide their long, beautiful hair, which was itself a coveted feature. Women who were unmarried or who had not yet entered into the duties of matrimony would often have their hair free-flowing and loose, symbolizing purity, youth, and fertility. Yet once a woman married, her hair was to be hidden away beneath a veil or a wimple, symbols of modesty and propriety. The hennin was, in many ways, a substitute for the youthful beauty of flowing hair. When married women wore their henna, it was as if they were pushing the limits of acceptable femininity, beautiful, yet unattainable, with their hair concealed under layers of silk, and their heads adorned with the towering, magnificent cone that indicated they were someone to be revered. In some ways, the hennin can be seen as a paradox at once, an adornment that celebrated a woman's beauty and femininity, while also hiding her natural, sensual features. It was a statement of beauty, but a beauty that was carefully constructed, molded, and regulated. While a woman's beauty could be freely displayed when she was young and unmarried, it became something more restrained once she married, to be shielded from public view. This concept of concealing the most beautiful parts of a woman's body was a pervasive idea in medieval society, suggesting that beauty was something to be guarded and protected, something to be kept private and exclusive, shared only with the one to whom she was bound in marriage. The men of the medieval period, however, had their own way of using headwear to signal their nobility. While they didn't wear towering hennons, they too adorned their heads with symbols of their status. Feathered caps, elaborately embroidered hoods, and circlets all spoke of the man's rank in the social hierarchy. Unlike women, men were often expected to display more understated elegance, to keep their appearance dignified yet not overbearingly ostentatious. These feathered caps were the male equivalent of the hennin, modest in their use of ornamentation, yet designed to signal that the wearer was not just a man, but a man of distinction with the wealth and taste to back up his position. These accessories were often worn with flowing robes and tunics, and like their female counterparts, noblemen also had to balance the line between extravagant display and controlled refinement. Where women's hennins reached for the sky, men's headwear stayed more grounded, focused on texture, material, and design rather than height. A feathered cap was often the key indicator of a nobleman's wealth, with colorful feathers chosen to match the luxuriousness of the man's wardrobe, which could be made of velvet, silk, and other rare, expensive fabrics. Men would often choose hats with feathers to signify their status, with certain colors and types of feathers being reserved for the highest ranks of nobility. Much like the hennin for women, the cap for men served as a social marker, a way to show that they had the privilege of not working in the fields. A nobleman's attire was as much about social distance as it was about comfort or practicality. If the feathered cap symbolized nobility, it also symbolized freedom from the labor that so defined the lives of commoners. Unlike the men who worked the land or toiled in the shops of medieval villages, these men dressed not for function but for display, and their accessories, the feathered cap, the velvet tunic, the silk sash, were all part of the visual narrative of their high station. Both men and women used their headwear as a visual shorthand for their place in the hierarchy of medieval society. But unlike the practical, utilitarian clothing of the lower classes, these hats and accessories spoke loudly and clearly about one's social and economic position. The hennin, for all its height and drama, was a clear statement of the wearer's ability to indulge in extravagance. It was a symbol of a lifestyle that was anything but common, a lifestyle that placed the wearer in a world apart, away from the sweat and toil of the peasants and in the rarefied air of noble society. Yet, for all its grandeur, the hennin was not immune to the forces of fashion. Like all styles, it had its rise and fall. Over time, the towering hat would lose favor, replaced by more modest and more practical head coverings. But for a time, it reigned supreme as the marker of nobility, elegance, and high social status. Whether it was the tall, dramatic peaks of the hennin or the feathered caps of noblemen, headwear in medieval Europe was not just a matter of function, it was a statement about who you were, where you came from, and how far above the common folk you stood. By the time the Renaissance arrived, fashion had begun to shift. The tall hennin was slowly replaced by softer, more rounded styles, and headwear began to take on a more ornamental role, with less focus on height and more on decoration. The elaborate, towering shapes that had once defined the nobility were abandoned in favor of simpler, more understated forms, and the feathered caps of the men were replaced by more contemporary styles. The hennin had done its job. It had declared, for a time, who was nobility and who was not. But as the centuries moved forward, fashion would change, as it always does, and what was once a towering symbol of aristocracy would fade into the past. In the end, the hennin, like all great fashion statements, was more than just a hat. It was a social marker, a symbol of wealth and status, and above all, a piece of medieval society that reflected the era's values, priorities, and ideals. And, as with all fashion, it would eventually pass, leaving only the faintest echoes of its grandeur behind. In the world of medieval beauty standards, The ideal female body was a carefully constructed vision, a delicate, slim form that seemed as if it might collapse under the weight of a breath. This body type, one that embodied fragility, was not just a matter of appearance, but a reflection of an entire social and cultural system that valued softness, gentleness, and the absence of physical strength in women. The perfect body was one that seemed to float above the ordinary struggles of daily life, as if untouched by the labor that defined the lives of common folk. For the women who could afford to chase this ideal, their bodies became canvases for the elaborate art of social display, a process that could take years and involve countless sacrifices in the pursuit of perfection. At the center of this ideal was the narrow waist. It wasn't just a matter of looking thin. No, this was about creating an illusion of fragility, as though the body was a soft, pliable structure that could be molded and shaped into an almost otherworldly form. The ideal waist was a sharp contrast to the broader, sturdier physiques that were prized in laborers and peasants. A woman's body had to be small, delicate, and fragile-looking, but it also had to project fertility, youthfulness, and softness, not just thinness. The waist, then, was a symbol not only of nobility but of sexual allure, of a body that, despite its seeming fragility, could endure the natural rhythms of life and reproduction. It was a complicated balance to strike, being both delicate and fertile, fragile yet full of life. One of the tools used to achieve this small-waisted ideal was the early corset. Though we often think of corsets as a later invention, the practice of waist cinching had already begun to take shape in the medieval period, albeit in a more primitive form than what we might recognize today. These early versions of the corset were not the tightly laced, rigid garments of the Victorian era, but were still powerful in their ability to mold a woman's body into the desired shape. Made from a variety of materials, linen, leather, and even metal, they were designed to constrict the waist, pulling the ribs inward and flattening the stomach. Unlike modern undergarments, which are often intended for comfort or support, these early corsets were less about ease and more about control. They restricted a woman's movement, making it difficult to sit comfortably or even breathe deeply. The result, however, was a body that adhered to the idealized shape of fragility, a tiny waist that could be encircled by the hands with soft curves that suggested both elegance and an innocence that was entirely separate from the ruggedness of manual labor. The desire for such a body was not limited to the upper classes, though it was, of course, the wealthiest women who had the leisure and resources to truly indulge in such bodily manipulation. For them, the corset was not only a fashion statement but also a social one. The use of the corset marked them as women who did not work, who were protected from the hard labor of the fields, and instead spent their time attending court, managing estates, or simply existing in a social world where appearances were paramount. The more constricted the waist, the more obvious it was that the wearer was a member of the nobility, someone who had the privilege of looking delicate and fragile while still being able to fulfill the reproductive expectations placed upon them. These corsets often served as a daily reminder of just how far one would go to maintain the image of fragility. They were worn for most of the day, tightened to their limits, and adjusted again and again to maintain that signature narrow waist. The discomfort, the constriction, was a small price to pay for the status that came with such an appearance. Some women even wore multiple layers of corsets at once, stacking them up to create an even smaller waistline and exaggerating the curve between their hips and bust. The result was a silhouette that was recognized instantly as a symbol of wealth and nobility. It was not a body built for labor or movement, but one designed to be admired from a distance, to be seen and appreciated as an ideal of grace and beauty. But, as with all beauty standards, the pursuit of the perfect body came at a cost. The tightly laced corsets were, unsurprisingly, not particularly healthy. They constricted not only the waist but also the ribs, pressing them inward and making it difficult to breathe fully. Women who wore them regularly often complained of dizziness, fainting spells, and a general sense of discomfort. The corsets could interfere with digestion, causing bloating and indigestion, and they sometimes led to long-term physical deformities. Over time, the muscles that supported the body's natural shape began to weaken, as the corset took over the role of holding everything in place. Some women even experienced a permanent shift in their ribcage, which remained constricted even after the corset was removed. In some cases, the corsets were so tight that they caused bruising or even internal injuries. Yet, despite these health risks, women continued to wear them, driven by the intense pressure to conform to an ideal that valued fragility above all else. The pressure to maintain this narrow-waisted, fragile look was not just physical but social. Women who chose not to wear corsets, or who wore them improperly, could be seen as less refined, less elegant, or even less virtuous. There was a social expectation that a woman's appearance should be controlled, that her body should reflect the care and attention that her high status demanded. To be seen as uncontrolled, with a figure that was too robust or too natural, was to risk being viewed as unrefined, perhaps even improper. The corset, then, was more than a garment. It was a tool of social control, a way to ensure that women remained in their place within the social hierarchy, both physically and metaphorically. For some, the corset was a symbol of their ability to meet the demands of beauty and nobility. It was a way to prove that they could withstand discomfort for the sake of looking perfect. For others, it was a reminder of how women's bodies were constantly being shaped and manipulated to fit an ideal that was often not their own. The concept of the ideal female body, the slim waist, the soft curves, the delicate figure was not just a fashion trend. It was a product of a system that used women's appearances to reinforce their roles in society. To be beautiful in the medieval world was to be a woman who was free from the burdens of labor and hardship, who could devote her time to beauty, to socializing, and to fulfilling the duties expected of her by those in power. But in this beauty, there was a darker truth, one that many women of the time could not escape, that their value was tied to their appearance, that their bodies were subject to societal expectations, and that these expectations, though they promised wealth and status, also came with an immense price. As we move into later periods, the ideal female body would continue to evolve, becoming more relaxed in its rigid expectations but still deeply embedded in societal standards. Yet, the pursuit of the perfect body, one that embodied fragility, purity, and grace, would remain a constant theme in the history of beauty. The narrow waist and soft curves would be replaced by other ideals, but the underlying pressure to conform to a prescribed idea of femininity would continue, shaping how women saw themselves and how they were seen by others. For centuries, women would continue to twist, bind, and cinch their bodies in pursuit of an ideal that was never quite attainable, always out of reach, always just a little more perfect than the last. But through it all, the idea of the fragile, delicate female body, with its narrow waist and soft curves, would remain a symbol of the past, a relic of an age where beauty was measured in discomfort and sacrifice, where a woman's worth was wrapped tightly around her waist, and where conformity was both the price and the reward. The body, after all, was never just a body. It was a statement, a piece of art, a symbol of power, and in the case of the medieval ideal, it was one that came with a cost that women paid whether they wanted to or not. In the world of medieval beauty standards, while the focus often rests on the idealized image of women slender, delicate, fragile, with their narrow waists and pale faces, men too were subjected to their own set of expectations, though these often went unspoken, quietly enforced through the gaze of society. The ideal of male beauty, much like that of women, was not just about physical attractiveness. It was about social position, moral fiber, and cultural refinement. To be beautiful, to be admired, was to hold a status that transcended mere physicality and moved into the realm of ideals of nobility, wisdom, and a carefully controlled image that sent a message: I am above the mundane labors of life. In this world, men were not just warriors, farmers, or traders. They were figures of intellect, of elegance, of moral and physical refinement. The first trait that stood out in the medieval ideal of a man's beauty was height. Tall men were seen as noble, a visual marker of their superiority. Taller figures were naturally more commanding, more imposing in their presence, lending them an air of authority and grandeur. A tall man was someone who was likely to be noticed in a crowd, his stature marking him as someone of importance, someone deserving of respect. Height was not just a matter of being able to look down upon others, it was symbolic of the space a man occupied in the social hierarchy. Being tall was akin to having a lofty position in the courts, an elevated rank in society. In the same way that the stature of a noblewoman was judged by her refinement and delicacy, the height of a nobleman reflected the scope of his influence, his power, his control over the affairs of the land and the people. But height alone wasn't enough. The ideal man wasn't just tall, he had to be lean. The medieval ideal of the male body leaned towards slenderness rather than bulk. The broad, muscular form of a working man, the kind who toiled in fields, lifted heavy weights, and carried the burdens of manual labor, was not a body that was prized in the circles of nobility. Muscularity, while it indicated strength, also marked a man as physically engaged in hard labor, and that was not something a nobleman could afford to display. Strength, when shown through muscle, was a sign of toil, of subservience to the earth and its labors. It was the working class, the peasantry, who were expected to have the broad shoulders and powerful arms that came from plowing fields, harvesting crops, or building structures. For the nobleman, however, a lean physique was the ideal. Muscle was seen as a sign of manual labor, and the ideal man, by contrast, was one who embodied refinement, not brute strength. Lean, tall men could be strong, of course, but their strength was not to be advertised. It was something restrained, something within that they didn't feel the need to flaunt. Instead, these men were defined by their posture. Refinement was everything. The tall, slender man was expected to walk with purpose, with grace, and above all, with dignity. His movements were measured, deliberate, every gesture made with a sense of quiet authority. To slouch or to have poor posture was unthinkable for a man of noble standing. It suggested a lack of discipline, a lack of respect for one's place in society. Men of status were expected to stand tall, to walk with their heads held high, their bodies straight, to embody the elegance of the courts in their very carriage. The way a man held himself reflected not only his self-respect, but his place in the social structure. His posture said everything. I am not a laborer. I do not toil beneath the sun or bend my back to the earth. The face of the ideal medieval man was just as important as his body. Defined cheekbones were a mark of refinement, a feature that conveyed nobility and intellect. High cheekbones were associated with an aristocratic lineage, a facial structure that spoke to good breeding and lineage. A defined jawline was another essential trait, marking a man's face with sharpness and precision, much like the idealized stoic expression he was expected to maintain. The medieval man was rarely seen smiling in portraits or art. His expression was serene, calm, and composed a face that reflected inner strength, intelligence, and a sense of emotional control. To smile openly was considered a sign of vulnerability, of weakness. The nobleman, the ideal man, was supposed to maintain a certain distance from others, emotionally and physically. His beauty wasn't something to be flaunted. It was something to be controlled, observed from a distance, appreciated not for its obvious charm, but for its quiet, restrained grace. In medieval art, the depiction of men, especially those of noble birth, often focused on the sharpness of their features, an angular jawline, high cheekbones, and a well-proportioned face. Portraits of kings, lords, and knights often favored a more angular, defined appearance, capturing their features in such a way as to convey their strength, nobility, and control. A soft face or a rounded appearance was never desirable for men, who were expected to look as if their facial structure had been carved from stone, sharp, defined, and unyielding. This physical ideal reinforced their roles as leaders, warriors, and figures of authority who had mastered not just their own bodies but their kingdoms and fates. The hair of the ideal medieval man followed a similar pattern of refinement. Shoulder-length hair was considered the most suitable for a man of status. It was neither too long nor too short, striking a balance between youth and maturity, between power and elegance. Hair was styled with care, often parted down the middle or pushed back from the face to reveal the sharpness of the jaw and the brilliance of the eyes. For men of the medieval court, their hair was an extension of their elegance, part of the presentation of their nobility. A well-groomed appearance was mandatory, and hair that was too wild or too untamed could be seen as a reflection of a lack of control or discipline. To be untidy was to be seen as unrefined, and so a nobleman's hair was styled to perfection, usually kept at a length that allowed for careful maintenance. For those noblemen who could afford it, personal grooming became an art. Just as women sought to lighten their hair or style it into intricate braids, men also invested in their appearance. Some men went so far as to use heated irons to curl their hair, a technique that not only required time and care, but a great deal of patience. Curls were seen as a mark of sophistication, an indication that the man could afford to dedicate time to grooming, a trait that emphasized his high status and self-control. Shorter haircuts, on the other hand, suggested that a man didn't have the time or inclination to style his hair properly, and this was a visual cue that he might be of a lower status or class. Hair was an indicator of more than just personal hygiene. It was an expression of refinement, of civility, and of the man's ability to maintain order, even in something as seemingly trivial as his hairstyle. Yet, for all the emphasis placed on a refined, elegant appearance, medieval beauty standards for men had one very strict requirement: no display of muscularity. Men of the upper class were expected to have broad shoulders and an athletic build, yes, but not the kind of muscles that were honed through hard labor. The ideal medieval man was not someone who worked the fields or carried heavy loads. Rather, he was a man who wielded power and intellect, not the physical strength that came from manual labor. Laborers and peasants, with their muscular builds and tanned skin, were the antithesis of the nobleman's ideal. In fact, a strong muscular physique was often viewed as something unattractive in a nobleman. The idea was that if a man had muscles, he must be working, and that would indicate that he was not of noble birth, but rather of the working class. This aversion to muscularity extended beyond the realm of mere aesthetics and seeped into the way society viewed class. A muscular man was often seen as a sign of a lack of refinement, someone who had spent his time working with his hands rather than cultivating his mind. The ideal man, then, was one whose body was a reflection of his intellectual and social status. He was lean, but not muscular. He had the appearance of strength, but that strength came from his lineage, his intellect, and his ability to command. His body was as much a symbol of his social standing as his well-maintained clothing or his finely groomed hair. In essence, the medieval ideal of male beauty was one that married grace with power, but not the kind of raw, physical power that was displayed through muscle. Instead, it was a more refined, intellectual power, one that reflected not physical endurance, but the endurance of a noble bloodline. The ideal man was tall, lean, with sharp features, groomed hair, and the unmistakable air of someone who had mastered both his appearance and his station in life. The notion of beauty in medieval men was not simply about looking good. It was about looking controlled, looking as if the weight of the world could rest on your shoulders without you ever having to break a sweat. This image of male beauty was, at its core, about distance. It was about creating an appearance that was both visually striking and emotionally remote. The ideal man, while admired for his sharp jawline, his defined cheekbones, and his elegant hair, was always somewhat distant, always somewhat removed from the common man. He was a man who commanded respect, not because of his physical strength, but because of the strength of his social standing, the discipline in his grooming, and the precision of his movement. The medieval man's beauty wasn't about raw physicality. It was about control. Control over his body, control over his environment, and control over the way he presented himself to the world. This control was what made him truly noble, and it was what made him beautiful. Medieval beauty standards were intricately woven into the social fabric of the time, deeply influencing perceptions of status, class, and morality. Beauty in this era wasn't just about external attractiveness. It was a reflection of one's place in society, and to a large extent, it was shaped by what was considered virtuous or noble. These ideals, while deeply rooted in the cultural values of the time, were often fraught with dangers. They led to practices that, though harmful, were undertaken in the pursuit of a particular ideal that combined aesthetics with class distinction. The pursuit of pale skin was perhaps the most emblematic of these beauty standards. Pale skin was not simply a sign of health. but a direct reflection of one's social standing. For the wealthy, pale skin was a way to signal that they lived a life of leisure, untouched by the manual labor of the fields. This was an era where the color of one's skin told a story. Dark skin indicated outdoor work, while pale skin was a marker of privilege and wealth. To achieve this ideal, individuals turned to dangerous substances like lead, mercury, and vinegar, despite the obvious health risks. The application of lead-based powders, though toxic and deadly in the long term, was seen as a necessary sacrifice to maintain a high social status. Women would often use a mixture of crushed pearls and egg whites to bleach their skin, and blue pigment was sometimes applied to simulate delicate veins beneath the skin. The pursuit of pale skin became a ritual of sorts, but it was a ritual that often carried with it devastating side effects, from hair loss to ulcers, and in some cases, premature death. The obsession with pale skin was closely tied to a broader cultural emphasis on fragility and delicacy. This desire for a delicate appearance led to extreme beauty practices, one of the most striking being the removal of eyebrows and the cultivation of high foreheads. In an effort to appear more refined, women would pluck or even shave their eyebrows completely. Some even resorted to extreme methods, using tweezers, wax, or even arsenic to achieve the desired effect. The high forehead was not just a beauty standard, it symbolized nobility, intelligence, and divine grace. The smoother and higher the forehead, the more elegant one appeared, signaling an aristocratic air that distinguished noble women from the common folk. These practices were indicative of the lengths to which individuals would go to ensure they met the ideals of beauty, even if it meant subjecting themselves to painful and often dangerous procedures. The idealization of fragility extended to more than just facial features. It was also embedded in the medieval ideal of the female body. A woman's body was expected to appear delicate and slight, with a focus on a narrow waist and soft curves. The emphasis on fragility in the female form was inextricably linked to the idea of nobility, as nobility was thought to be reserved for those who did not engage in physical labor. The thin, willowy figure became a symbol of both class and virtue, suggesting that the woman who embodied these traits was pure, gentle, and removed from the harsh realities of working-class life. Waist-cinching methods, such as the early versions of corsets, were widely used to create the illusion of fragility. These garments were designed to shape the body into the desired form, emphasizing a slim waist and soft curves. Though not as restrictive as the corsets of later centuries, these garments were still uncomfortable, yet they were seen as a necessary tool to achieve the refined, delicate silhouette that was so coveted in the medieval period. As much as beauty was tied to physical appearance, it was also inseparable from the concept of virtue. Women's beauty was often seen as a reflection of their moral and spiritual character. The church, which played a central role in medieval life, had a profound influence on how beauty was perceived. On one hand, being beautiful was seen as a sign of divine favor. On the other, it could be seen as a temptation to sin, especially when women used their beauty to gain power or attention. Vanity was considered a sin, and those who were deemed overly concerned with their appearance were often viewed with suspicion. Beauty, in this context, was not just a matter of outward appearance, but a matter of moral standing. The ideal beauty was one that was modest, virtuous, and understated. Yet the very practices that women used to achieve this beauty, such as the application of makeup and the shaping of their bodies, were themselves a contradiction of these values. The tension between modesty and the desire to achieve a certain ideal of beauty created a moral tightrope that many women had to navigate, balancing their pursuit of perfection with the expectations of humility and piety. These ideals of beauty were not confined to women alone, though. The standards for men were equally specific, though they focused more on refinement and composure than on physical delicacy. The ideal man was tall, lean, and defined, with a sharp jawline and high cheekbones. Men were expected to maintain a refined posture and to present themselves with dignity and grace. Muscularity was not desired, as it indicated manual labor, which was associated with lower social classes. In contrast, men who appeared refined, but not overly strong, embodied the values of nobility and gentility. While women were required to maintain a fragile and delicate appearance, men were expected to project strength through refinement rather than brute force. This ideal of the nobleman was meant to evoke both physical grace and mental sharpness, with a certain level of control and self-possession being the ultimate goal. Hair, too, was an essential part of this ideal, with shoulder-length hair being the norm for men. Long, styled hair was often a sign of nobility and refinement. Men, like women, were expected to present themselves in a way that conveyed dignity, and this was often achieved through elaborate hairstyles, feathered caps, and other accessories. While muscularity and roughness were discouraged, attention to one's hair and overall appearance was a crucial part of maintaining one's social status. Unlike women, whose beauty was more intricately linked to their bodies and faces, men's beauty was largely associated with their comportment, attire, and refined presentation. These beauty standards were not just superficial. They were deeply entwined with cultural notions of gender, class, and morality. For women, the pursuit of beauty was both a means of securing social status and a reflection of their moral standing. The ideal medieval woman was not just physically attractive, but also pure, modest, and virtuous, qualities that were reflected in her appearance. The tension between the pursuit of beauty and the demands of morality created a complicated dynamic in which women were both encouraged and chastised for their efforts to conform to the beauty ideals of their time. Men, in contrast, were less burdened by the contradictions that women faced. Their beauty was largely based on refinement and dignity rather than fragility or purity. The ideal man was one who could carry himself with grace and composure, embodying the aristocratic values of nobility. Yet, both men and women were united by the cultural understanding that beauty was a powerful force, one that could be used to assert one's place in the social hierarchy. Ultimately, the beauty standards of the medieval era were not just about looking good, they were about appearing to be something more. They were about status, virtue, and power. They were about navigating a world where one's appearance could determine not only one's social standing but also one's moral worth. Even as these beauty ideals were often dangerous and unhealthy, they were seen as necessary sacrifices in the pursuit of a higher status. The desire for pale skin, delicate bodies, and refined features was not simply a desire for physical attractiveness. It was a desire to conform to a social order that placed great value on appearance and virtue. And in this pursuit, beauty became a way of not just presenting oneself to the world, but of shaping one's identity and place within it.